My name is David Balat. I'm the executive director for Free to Care. We are a coalition of 32 member organizations representing over 8 million people nationally, including over 70,000 physicians. So we're very proud to be a part of amplifying the voice of both doctor and patient, and that doctor-patient relationship that we consider to be so sacred. What do we believe? Healthcare is fundamentally about the doctor-patient, physician-patient relationship. We believe in medical professionals being a part of the care of the patient without the existence of these middlemen coming in and interfering between what doctors do, pharmacists do, nurses do. You all have the training. PBMs, I can assure you, do not. They exist for a whole different reason. Healthcare can be transformed through price transparency, access, and choice. And more importantly, and I think that this is where we win and where we have gotten so far, is healthcare is personal, not partisan. For the most part, we need to focus on the patient and not on the political platform of the day. Ultimately, we look to folks like Antonio that bring great research, communicated in such a way that it's understandable and, even more importantly, actionable. So really thankful to be a part of this group. We wanted to bring this group together because each of you have an existing position on reforming PBM practices or have a stake in this important conversation. Looking to see who's attending. You guys have been players in pushing legislation at the state and federal level for PBM reform and accountability. One of the things that is important and that is before us is the ability to submit a comment to the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC comment period has been extended to May 25th. They gave us, it was only going to be 4 days from today when we first scheduled this, but it's been extended out to another month. And we're going to provide the link for you to submit the comment if you haven't done so already. As of my looking yesterday, there were 19,000 plus comments submitted. Because there's been so much redundancy in how many have been sent by groups like ours, because of the 19, I know that we've sent 16,000 plus as a group. Many of them have been identical, so the FTC throws out the identicals, and that's why you'll see maybe 484 comments. But as far as what has been received by them, it's been nearly 20,000, which that makes a difference, and it matters because we can go and talk about how important this is to so many people. So I guess this is the opportunity that I have to try to pronounce our speaker's name correctly. Antonio Ciaccia, born and raised in the world of pharmacy. I've had lots of practice. Antonio has been crawling around pharmacies his entire life. That's why he dresses that way. After 3 years as a pharmacy tech and 2 years of pre-pharmacy curriculum, he diverted course, graduating from Ohio State in 2007 with dual degrees in communication and political science before moving into the world of association management, eventually heading up government affairs for the Ohio Pharmacists Association. After years of studying the pharmacy marketplace, Antonio became increasingly perplexed, as we all have been, and concerned as he saw the drug costs spiking while payouts to pharmacies were declining and more drugs were being excluded from plan coverage. Knowing something was being lost somewhere in the middle of an ever-growing transaction, he spent years working to crack the drug pricing code and pull the rug out from what he believes is one of the most dysfunctional marketplaces in the world. I think we can all agree on that. Today, he serves as the president of 3 Axis Advisors, a consulting firm that works with Medicaid fraud control groups, provider groups, research firms, technology companies, law firms, investment analysis, analysts, employers, government agencies, and the list goes on. Also the CEO and co-founder of 46 Brooklyn Research, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving transparency and accessibility of drug pricing data for the American public. Antonio is also, I consider him a friend. Look forward to this discussion. Thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. And let's have this talk because this is top of mind right now. And I'm very proud of the fact that 3 years ago, when we first started this coalition, many people, including lawmakers, didn't even know what PBM stood for. And today we're in a different world.
Well, David, Appreciate being with you. And yeah, I'm very much with you. I mean, I remember when I entered the pharmacy marketplace, nobody knew what a PBM was. And today, as we all know, it stands for perfect business model. Uh, I stole that from a state senator in Ohio who used that in a joint Medicaid oversight committee hearing, and I'll never forget it. But yeah, I mean, PBMs have become an extremely complex entity. They're no longer PBMs, right? Because they're vertically integrated. They own insurers, they own pharmacies, they own GPOs now. And so, you know, when we talk about PBMs, we have to look at them as much more broadly than their original functions.
That's exactly right. I've had a recent debate with the head of the Insurance Trade Association, and it's sharing with them the transparent data that we've received from the Department of Insurance, showing where the rebates are going. Less than 1% of all the billions of dollars go back to the patient. The response by the insurers is, well, it helps to keep the premiums down. And I believe you saw that. How would you have responded to that?
Well, you know, I think in some regards they're right. You know, they are using rebates that are received from drug makers in part to lower premiums for everyone. And if we zoom out and let's just pretend let's pretend that we live in the twilight zone here. And let's say that PBMs and insurance companies aren't pocketing a single dime of rebates. And not just rebates, let's also pretend that they're not pocketing a single dime of rebate related fees, whether at the PBM level or at the rebate aggregator level. Let's just pretend that the insurer and PBM, their hands are totally clean. They are not holding on to any drug maker price concessions. Then the argument that they're making is that we use those rebate dollars that we receive from drug makers as a means to lower premiums for everyone. So what does that mean? It means that patients and employers and government programs are paying higher list prices for medications than they would otherwise have not if the rebates didn't exist. Everybody is paying more on a drug by drug basis in order to generate that rebate in the first place. So over at 46 Brooklyn, we call rebates money from sick people, which is exactly what they are. If you look at a drug like Lantus, which has a list price of around $285 per vial as of last year, Sanofi, the drug maker that makes that product, only brings in around $40 per vial. So imagine how goofy that is, that a $285 list price product, the net price that the drug maker brings in is around 40. Now, some might argue that 40 is still too high. Some of the drug maker might say it's too low, but divorce yourself from whether or not the 40 is too much or too little and say, what is going on with the $245 left over? And why are patients and plan sponsors paying hundreds of dollars for something that in fact could be just 40?
Yeah, let's come out of the twilight zone and get back into the real zone. I think everybody on this call and anybody you could stop on the street would say, my premiums aren't going down. And in fact, year over year, the increase on premiums is easily double digits. So that money really isn't going to contribute to decrease premiums and making them affordable as they claim. And we also, looking at what Optum, what United has said or Cigna has said, their record profits in any given quarter can be attributed to the work of their PBM, which is why, we talked about that vertical integration in the beginning. It was a great business move for both the PBMs and the insurance companies to do that, particularly because of the medical loss ratio that they benefit from as well. But, there's just, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, without question. Look, I was at a hearing in Indiana a couple months ago where they were working on a piece of legislation that would require all rebates and discounts to be realized at the point of sale. So let me caveat that it was 85% or more. So what the bill in question would do is say, look, if the PBM is receiving $100 of rebates on a particular drug, they have to pass at least $85 to the patient at point of sale so that they're not paying the full list price. Now, regardless of whether you agree with that policy or not, some people might argue that the rebates belong in the hands of the employer or whatever you believe. A patient came in and had a brown bag and dumped it out on the table. And so as everybody's debating about where these rebate dollars should go, should the PBM have the right to keep them? Should the employer get them? Should the patient give them? All this bickering about where the rebate should go. Patient comes in, drops the brown bag on the table and says, this is how much, these vials of insulin, this is what I take every single month. I pay hundreds of dollars for each one of these vials, and I can't afford it. I am here today to tell you I am actively rationing my insulin, putting my life at risk because I can't afford these drugs. And it was just a whoa, like talk about perspective, that as we're bickering about where these rebates should go, whether should the employer keep, meanwhile, we have a patient that is dramatically overpaying, putting their life at risk. And so we have to ask ourselves, why do we have benefits coverage in the first place? It's to make sure that that patient doesn't end up in that position where they are putting their life at risk, ending up in the hospital. And here we are paying overinflated amounts for prescription drugs and putting those patients at risk because of this convoluted rebate scheme.
Yeah, and I recently came across some research that showed that if the patient received the after rebate price and that consequently increased the premiums, there would still be a net savings to the patient. They would still save money because the cost that they're paying out for medications is far in excess to the smaller increase that they would get in the premiums. You know, you're talking about in it was Indianapolis, I think is what you said. But this all started, it seems like, in Ohio. What happened in Ohio that got this started and has been steamrolling through the country?
Well, PBM reform, I would argue, probably had its hallmark moment when Heather Bresch, the CEO of Mylan in 2016, testified in Congress as she was being grilled about the prices of EpiPens. And look, not to defend, her by any stretch, no, I'm not going to comment on whether EpiPen is too much, too little, or just fair. But credit to Heather Bresch, when she was getting grilled for this high list price of EpiPen, she finally said, look, we only make a little bit of that price, we the manufacturer, and a lot of that is going to rebates. And that was really the first time in a significant public forum that the phrase PBM was uttered in a meaningful way. And since then, there's been this just ongoing, what I'll just loosely define as an onboarding process of understanding of who PBMs are and how they operate. Well, in my home state of Ohio, when I was working with the Ohio Pharmacists Association, pharmacists were complaining to me about significant underpayments within our Medicaid managed care program, to the point where many pharmacies could no longer stay in business. We lost around 200 net pharmacies across the state of Ohio in just a 3-year period, essentially wiping out 10% of all of our pharmacies. But it wasn't just the loss of the pharmacies. We were losing them in the most underserved parts of our state. Yeah. The wealthy communities, their pharmacies were doing okay. The pharmacies that were serving Medicaid beneficiaries, they were getting wiped out. And so the pharmacists were calling me saying, Antonio, I bought this drug for $100. The PBM and the Medicaid managed care program is only paying me $70. I can't continue to do this. And obviously that's a hypothetical. This was happening across an entire portfolio of drugs within the Medicaid program. I went back to state officials and asked them what happened. Were there budget cuts that I missed? Was I about to get fired by my boss for missing a piece of policy that cut all these reimbursements? And they looked at me like I was crazy. They said, Antonio, I don't know what to tell you, but I don't even know if we believe you, because we're paying more for prescription drugs than we ever have. And so I kind of sat down and said, wait a minute, how can pharmacies be seeing cuts to the degree of 60 to 80% on all their Medicaid drug transactions, but then on the end of the spectrum, when Medicaid is cutting the checks, they're spending more? And so my background actually started in journalism at Ohio State. And so when I looked at this, I said, man, there's a story here. There is something happening here. Somebody's not telling us something. And I started to meet with Medicaid officials on an ongoing basis to try and get some answers. Long story short, I wasn't getting them. And so Fortunately, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have some really valuable data that lives on their website. One of them is the National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, or NADAC. What it is an ongoing survey of pharmacies across the country where CMS asks them, what did you pay to put the drugs on the shelf? And so they ask about 2,000 pharmacies that every month, of which about 400 to 600 respond. And with that, they can go through and quantify what the average cost of each drug is on a month-by-month basis. Then they have another data file called the CMS State Drug Utilization Data, which is a generalized but itemized receipt for every state Medicaid program across the country, where you can see on a drug-by-drug, quarter-by-quarter, state-by-state basis what they're being charged. So imagine what could happen and what possibilities start opening up when you smash those two data sets together, where you could see the real cost of the drugs versus what the state Medicaid programs are being charged. And as we saw over time, there was a growing gap, that as drug prices were going down, the costs of the state were going up. I presented that back to Medicaid officials, and whether it was because they were too slow or didn't want to do anything about it, I was impatient and said, I'm not waiting any longer. So I walked out of a meeting with state Medicaid officials and then crossed two streets and walked into the Columbus Dispatch headquarters, where I proceeded to tell members of the newspaper about this growing gap that we were seeing in this transaction, not just in Ohio, but in states across the country. That started the Columbus Dispatch's nationally award-winning side effect series. That day that I presented all this information to them, they said, Antonio, I don't know really what to say about this. This is kind of confusing, but they said that they promised that they would probably be able to get 2 or 3 stories out of it. Fast forward the tape, they've done about 200. And it has resulted in a massive amount of scrutiny within the state of Ohio and beyond. Their journalism and their investigation prompted an audit from state officials. Our auditor at the time, Dave Yost, who's today our state attorney general, decided to open the books to see exactly what he could find within the black box. And what he found was $244 million of hidden spread pricing markups. And spread pricing is a term of art that we talk about in PBM world, but for lay people, spread pricing is nothing more than when a PBM pays a pharmacy one rate, bills the plan sponsor, or in this instance, a Medicaid program, a different rate, pockets the difference, and never tells either side about it. And so when the state auditor opened the books, he found $244 million of gap, or what accounted for as more than $6 per prescription drug transaction that PBMs were skimming off the top, thus inflating the overall capitation rates and distorting the medical loss ratios within our Medicaid program. That's how it all started.
So, and that's a compelling story, and what the Dispatch has done in putting those stories out has been fantastic. And what happened in Ohio? What have we learned? And can you provide any insights into what's going on in the state of Pennsylvania?
Absolutely. So, in Ohio, after that audit happened, it was kind of like the proverbial oh crap moment. State officials, who tell people that they're going to get elected and watch every penny, felt kind of embarrassed, from the legislature all the way up to the governor's office. And to be sure, I felt that there was more that they could have been doing. But if I'm being fair, Ohio was not unique. This was something that was occurring in Medicaid programs across the country. It's occurring in different ways, shapes, and forms in the Medicare program. And it's also happening to commercial employers, small, medium, and large across the country. And so while Ohio was kind of the butt of the joke, in all actuality, they were the first to kind of flush this out into the public ether. After they found out that PBMs had been taking advantage of them through the spread pricing phenomenon, they fired the PBMs involved, and they redesigned the contracts, and actually got just in the process now of firing and rehiring the Medicaid managed care plans that were responsible or irresponsible for overseeing this problem in the first place. That has set off another chain of events on the litigation front. I mentioned that former auditor Dave Yost is now state attorney general. since he's been Attorney General, he has since filed litigation within our State Bureau of Workers' Compensation program against alleged PBM overcharges, our State Highway Patrol Fund over alleged PBM overcharges, and in our state Medicaid program, where he filed litigation against Centene and their PBM. And Centene, while they admitted no wrongdoing, did feel compelled to send a large check for $88 million to the state of Ohio and set aside an additional $1.1 billion to settle alleged fraud, waste, and abuse cases in states across the country. If you've never heard of a settlement like that before, I would understand. That is the first settlement that a state attorney general has had with a big PBM over alleged fraud, waste, and abuse allegations within their state Medicaid agencies. And it's really only the beginning. Since then, a number of states have been jumping in and banning certain PBM activities, requiring them to be licensed and monitored within state insurance departments, prohibiting certain things like gag clauses and steering and formulary exclusions or copay accumulators. The list goes on and on. There has been a tidal wave of regulation that is at the state level that is seeking to realign PBMs to their true function, which is supposed to be working on our behalf to lower the cost of medications. But what we see and what these state Medicaid agencies and attorney generals are seeing is that many times they are lowering the cost for themselves, but they aren't passing those savings along to us as taxpayers and employers.
I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the other states in just a moment. You know, as good as the work Ohio has been doing since the disruption has taken place, what have we learned from that? What can states like Pennsylvania do to hold these actors more accountable? How can we improve upon what has been done in Ohio?
Well, the first thing to do is change the way that you think about managed care. You know, the idea of managed care is that, look, if the state does Medicaid benefits itself, or if the state were to do public employee retirement benefits itself, that it would be inefficient. You know, hey, big surprise, a government agency being inefficient, right? So the idea was that managed care was supposed to bring in private forces and market forces to help make Medicaid spending more efficient. And again, all that sounds wonderful on paper. And be clear, I'm a big believer in managed care, but recognize that businesses are in the business of making money. And so far too often, we've allowed managed care plans and their subsidiary companies, in this case PBMs, free rein to really do as they please. And when you tell a private company that there's an endless spigot of money, don't be surprised if they bring extra buckets. This is exactly what's happening in Medicaid managed care today, is that the business of managed care has become so sophisticated and convoluted that Medicaid agencies and other state agencies are having a really difficult time keeping up with them. David, if you could imagine, let's say we were to devise a government program tomorrow, and let's say that government program was going to buy prescription drugs for every single citizen across the state of Pennsylvania. And we said, here's how we're going to pay for it. Well, we're going to get a bunch of tax money from taxpayers. We're going to build up this big pot of money, and then we're going to go and turn around and let's say we're going to sign a contract with Walgreens or Kroger or some independent pharmacy, whatever it is. And what we're going to do is we're going to pay them whatever they bill us. That would be stupid, right? Why would we go to a pharmacy, any pharmacy, and say, we'll pay whatever you invoice us? Now, that'd be a horrible idea. Of course, the pharmacy, not unless they're saints, unless they're engaging in nothing but the practice of altruism, we should assume that they might take liberties in what they invoice us, right? And so PBMs and managed care plans were supposed to act as a necessary friction to say, look, we're going to work on the state's behalf to not overpay. Well, now that PBMs make money off the transaction, now that PBMs own their own pharmacies, now that they make money off of drug makers, now that they can essentially slap whatever markups they want on top of that prescription drug transaction, there's absolutely no difference than having a program that's architected that says, just send us the bill if you're Walgreens versus just send us the bill if you're Express Scripts or CVS Caremark. And so one of the things I tell states all the time is stop trusting your managed care plans. Stop trusting your PBMs, because you wouldn't trust the pharmacies and drug makers if they were in the same position. And so one of the things that I've been advocating for is disallowing PBMs from subjectively setting the prices in these state Medicaid programs, recognizing the huge conflict of interest they have in doing so. And if you're looking for a reason why, let's use Pennsylvania as a perfect example. As we were looking at the state of Ohio and seeing these massive overcharges within our Medicaid program, that same data set we could use to look at prescription drug prices in Medicaid programs across the country, including our neighboring state of Pennsylvania. And what we saw were the same markups within Ohio reflected sometimes even worse in Pennsylvania, where the state of Ohio might be getting billed $100 per pill for one product, and that same product could be billed in Pennsylvania for $110 per pill. And actually, Pennsylvania tried to seek information to investigate this right around the same time Ohio was. And the state auditor at the time, a gentleman by the name of Eugene DePasquale, was also looking into this and demanding information from the state managed care plans and PBMs. I actually had a conversation with Auditor DePasquale at the time, because he was looking for the playbook that Ohio had followed to try and get their data. And instead, he was rebuffed at every turn. So imagine how stupid and insane this system is, that somebody who is elected as state auditor by citizens of Pennsylvania is told by private companies working on behalf of the state Medicaid program, where they're cutting the biggest checks out of any agency in the country or in the state, and they're telling the state auditor that he does not have the right to audit the books. That is a problem, and it has to be rectified. You will never have accountable spending if the individual who is elected to audit the books isn't allowed to do so.
You know, and accountability, transparency, those are the big items that we can do at the state level. I want to hear you talk about what else can be implemented at the state level. What we're looking at, you know, our coalition is more federally focused, although we are looking to get more involved at the state level. But you know, where does all this flow from? It flows from the fact that PBMs in 2003 were granted safe harbor from the anti-kickback statute. Wrap your brain around that. They were given an exemption from the anti-kickback statute. They've been given the ability to, as a function of their business model, to provide kickbacks. They can function like the mafia legally in the country throughout. So that's where much of this has begun. It's because the federal government has given them the power to do so, and they're using that power very liberally. With what we've learned in Medicaid, Antonio, how do we take some of what we've learned and apply it to commercial and Medicaid markets?
Well, you know, Medicaid has been a godsend in a way from a public accountability perspective, and I'll explain why. You know, at every turn we are told that drug pricing data is proprietary. And look, I understand and respect, you know, private businesses wanting to hide their secret sauce for how they conduct their business, right? I get that. When it comes to healthcare, it feels a little bit more goofy, doesn't it? Especially as we're talking about public dollars or mandated dollars, if you're talking about the ACA, that employers and Medicare programs are paying for all of this. You know, when you walk into a CVS pharmacy and buy a stick of bubble gum, the big joke is that you'll get a receipt that's about a mile long, right? Well, how come the same company who owns their own PBM, when you spend millions of dollars in prescription drugs, isn't giving you the same degree of itemized receipt, isn't giving you that same degree of transparency in what you bought and how much you bought it for? And we all know why. It's because there's a lot of margin and mystery. And anybody that can make money in a secretive way for a product that we all need in order to survive is going to be very successful in making money. So when it comes to, you know, what accountability looks like in the commercial sector, you know, my firm works on behalf of employers and law firms that act as general counsel to some of the largest companies in the country. And we get to investigate the drug pricing data and see exactly how what we've learned in Medicaid could extrapolate into the commercial sector. And we like to think that the biggest employers have all the resources they need to hold this stuff accountable. I promise you they do not. We see some of the biggest companies in states and across the country that you would believe, you would give them the benefit of the doubt that they have this all figured out. They unfortunately don't. Companies that specialize in what they specialize in don't specialize in prescription drugs. We hire PBMs and benefits consultants to do that. But as we've learned, they're highly conflicted in that regard. They look to employers as opportunities for more and more revenue. In the Medicare program, that problem exists just as much, except it's the patients that are getting taken advantage of, not necessarily a collective entity. So to give you an example, one of the most expensive medications that we've seen over the last few years is a drug called Tecfidera. Tecfidera is a very popular medication meant for the treatment of multiple sclerosis. Again, thanks to the transparency provided by CMS, we've been able to dig in and look at some of the pricing and coverage behaviors of the largest Medicare Part D plans for seniors that are struggling with MS. And Tecfidera is a drug that could cost somebody tens of thousands of dollars every single year. It is one of the most expensive brand products that you can find. Thankfully, last year, generic competition entered the marketplace. And what do we know about generic competition? Is generic competition can crush the price of a product. Something that was once $100,000 could literally end up being hundreds of dollars within just a year, thanks to the aggressive churn of competition in the generic marketplace. Well, that exact same thing happened last year with Tecfidera, where at the beginning of the year, generic competition finally entered the marketplace and took a drug that was literally $80,000 a year and brought it down to a cost of just hundreds. So the question then is, the marketplace worked. What happened to patient costs? And what we found is that by the third quarter of last year, months after the generic had really crushed the price, we found that over half of seniors were enrolled in Part D plans that still required them to buy the brand name product, even though the generic was available. Let me repeat, we're talking about a difference of tens of thousands of dollars in cost per year, and over half of seniors were enrolled in plans who were forced to continue buying the brand product. And we're told that the generic one essentially did not exist. They refused to cover the generic. What a backward system, where we rely on generic competition to be the pressure valve relief of the old expensive brand name products, only to have the insurance plans and their PBMs essentially say, those products don't exist, you don't get access to them.
Antonio, stories like that just make my blood boil. We've talked about a lot of bad actors. Given the leeway that the PBM industry has been given, are there any good ones? What does a good one look like? Do they exist?
So, without a doubt. I mean, I sometimes I have to punish myself, because when I talk about PBMs, I talk about them in a collective sense, meaning that anybody who identifies as a PBM might feel somewhat offended by the way that I talk about some of the games that are being played in the industry, and that's fair. Look,
I think they may somewhat expect it.
I think that's why they exist in the first place. But I think it's important to note that there are good and bad actors at every level of the drug supply chain. There are good manufacturers. There are ones that take advantage. There are good wholesalers. There are those that take advantage. Lord knows there are great pharmacies, and I have seen some really bad ones in my time as well. And the same thing occurs in the PBM and insurer space. On the PBM side, there are, look, there's the old Jeff Bezos line, your margin is my opportunity. And what have we been saying about PBMs? They're biting off more than they should chew. They're packing too much cost into the pharmaceuticals. So anytime that somebody is taking too much, there's somebody's opportunity to come in and take less. And so we see good actors or better actors that are working to better align their models so that they reduce their conflicts of interest and aren't so reliant on the all-you-can-eat buffet of markups. And so, for example, we have done previous research work for Capital RX. Capital RX is a transparent PBM, a startup They're by no means perfect, but again, they are aligning their business model around a clearinghouse pricing system, where rather than them inventing prices, they acknowledge that they have a conflict of interest, lean on CMS National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, a transparent pricing benchmark with which they can use to adjudicate claims. That's by no means an endorsement of Capital RX, but what that is me saying, I like when PBMs reduce those conflicts of interest and divorce themselves of the forbidden fruit of subjectively setting prices. There's companies like Navitus who is doing a more transparent job. They're co-owned by Costco. There's companies like Ventegra. There's companies like Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drug Company. They've looked at opening their own PBM. And be clear, I'd even see the largest PBMs, Optum RX, Express Scripts, and CVS Caremark. I've seen different degrees of bad with them, meaning that I've seen different degrees of good. They don't always take advantage of clients. If a client has good leverage and they're sophisticated enough, I have seen instances where even the largest PBMs are willing to offer a better deal than they're offering to others. And the lesson there is that we don't necessarily have a problem with an individual company. I think this is something that was really lost in a lot of the Centene headlines, is that after Centene settled with the state of Ohio, I think the prevailing, attitude after that was, well, Centene is one of the bad ones. Well, you can say that, but to me, it's less about the vendor. It's more about the policies that govern the vendor. And exactly so right. Whenever I'm giving counsel to a state Medicaid program or employer, people will assume that I'll say, look, don't work with them, work with them. Absolutely not. Instead, remove yourself from the fictitious idea that you can trust any for-profit company in this business. Instead, trust the contract and trust the policies and transparency and accountability that help you hold that vendor accountable.
Absolutely. Antonio, we've got 3 or 4 minutes before we open it up for Q&A, but I'd like you touched on it. We've had discussion about it. Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drugs. It's not a pharmacy. It's not really a PBM. What is it? Are they really disruptive, and is it more bark than bite? What's the proper way to look at it?
Well, interestingly, I have been following what the Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drug Company has been doing for some time, because I was fascinated by some of the rhetoric right out of the gate. And be clear, I've never watched Shark Tank actually, but I've seen a lot of headlines of Mark Cuban in the past. Obviously, very successful businessman. The reason that I was always interested in Mark Cuban is because every so often, maybe every year or so, I'd see an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that maybe Mark Cuban was about to buy the Pittsburgh Pirates and finally change them into a winner. So I've been crossing my fingers, hoping for that to happen. It has not happened yet. So with that in mind, I've sometimes wondered, is Cuban for real? Is he a headline guy or is he a substance guy? And one thing that I've learned over the last few couple of years, since I've seen him engaging in this space, is that guy really understands what's broken in this industry. The entire prescription drug supply chain operates off of artificially inflated prices. And big surprise, everybody in the drug channel can benefit from those artificially inflated prices. And pharmacies even have their inflated usual and customary prices that they're billing back to insurers in hopes of maximizing their reimbursement. Now, pharmacies are way too often saddled with underpayments, so they need some of those overpayments to keep the boat afloat. But the truth remains that everybody is operating off of these artificially inflated AWPs, or usual and customary prices. Well, what we've seen is a cottage industry starting to grow over the last couple of years. There's a pharmacy just not too far from where I'm sitting right now called Freedom Pharmacy in Pickerington, Ohio. They've pulled out of the insurance game. It was a pharmacy owner by the name of Nate Hux who said, look, this model isn't working anymore. And I need to prepare for a world where my insurance-based pharmacy may not be able to hold on. And so what he decided to do is, right next door to his traditional independent pharmacy that received Medicaid and received PBM compensation, he opened a new pharmacy that didn't take insurance and instead worked with patients on a strict cash basis. So rather than having his prices dictated to him, he took back control of his practice and opened a pharmacy where he could no longer play the inflated list price game and instead offer true low cash prices to patients. There's another pharmacy in Pittsburgh called Blueberry Pharmacy that's doing the exact same thing. Mark Cuban and his cost plus drug company has been architected to do the exact same thing, where they're saying, look, we know that insurance and PBMs encourage the use of artificially inflated prices. And so we as a mail order pharmacy are going to step in and say, we are not going to play that game. And instead we are going to seek out and in some instances create the lowest cost medications possible and sell them at a transparent 15% markup to anybody who wishes to buy them, whether that be pharmacies or patients doing so as a mail order pharmacy. So I've actually, full disclosure, we've done some data analytics work for the Mark Cuban Cost Plus Drug Company, and I was actually down there looking at their facility just a couple of weeks ago. And what I see is a tremendous opportunity, not just because of what they're building, but because of the megaphone that Mark Cuban has that can really kind of clear some of the fog. Because look, while we that study this have been happy with the degree with which PBMs have become more known, at the same time, most of the general public still has no idea how the system operates. And so one of my hopes is that the more that Mark Cuban and his CEO, Alex Oshmiansky, can help educate the more general public about some of these industry dynamics, perhaps the more likely it is that either they or others can be successful, or perhaps in addition, lawmakers will start paying attention and start understanding some of the backwards way that this industry is currently architected.
Excellent. No, I completely agree with you. He definitely has a megaphone, and he's recently even said that the bigger guys aren't paying attention to him yet. Emphasis on the word yet. Antonio, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation. We already have some questions, so let's just transition right into that. The first one came by way of the chat from Mel Brodsky. Mel is head of the Philadelphia Association of Retail Druggists. Mel, thank you for being on. He says, Antonio, have you talked to the people doing the survey in Pennsylvania, the budget and finance, and do you feel that they know what they are doing, and will this survey accomplish its goal? I'm assuming you know what that means.
So my team has had discussions with the folks in Pennsylvania that are conducting their inquiry into PBM issues. Do I feel they know what they are doing, and will this survey accomplish its goals? I believe that they are. I believe that they have a genuine desire to figure out every little nuance there is to know in this system. In our discussions with them, I saw folks that were motivated to, quote, do good. Now, this is less a comment about them. It's more a comment about everybody. Is that just when you think you have the answers, they change the questions on you, right? And so look, one thing that I've often said is that anybody who tells you that they are the expert or an expert on drug pricing, I always say, take that with a grain of salt, because I study this all day, every day, and I'm humble enough to acknowledge that there's no way that I know everything. And so I caution anybody, whether it's the folks in Pennsylvania or the folks in other states or the other attorney generals and auditors that we work with in states across the country, is that don't act as if you have all the answers, because as soon as you think you do, you don't.
And we've got a couple that want to ask some questions, got some hands up. I'm just going to ask for all of those. We're going to try to get to you. If you have, we're going to use Jeopardy rules. Please form your comment in the form of a question, and let's keep it brief so that Antonio can get to it and we can get on to other questions. So let's see. First up is our dear friend, Dr. Marion Mass. Let's see here. I don't know how.
Hi.
There you are.
Hello there. It's so nice to be on this. You guys did a great job. Unfortunately, I had to join late, and I'm going to watch the reruns, and then I'll spread it all over social media so that everyone gets to learn more. And what a blessing this morning. I was checking in on a friend who is another pediatrician like me. She's got breast cancer, and her husband has terrible, terrible asthma. And so it'll be a little bit lengthy, but I'd love you to explain more on this issue, and then I'll share this with her too. So her husband wasn't able to walk across the room without being short of breath, would wake up every morning coughing to the point of vomiting. And then he got his hands on some samples of Dupixent, and his life changed. And then the samples ran out, and the insurance company stopped covering it, did the non-medical switch, which she didn't even understand what it was until I just explained it to her this morning, and switched him to Nucala, which is doing nothing. So now they're asking him to do the old step 1-2 therapy, like cha-cha-cha. Isn't that good? Cha-cha.
That's
Like
very
Anthony
good.
Cha. Yes, there you go. You could use that. But so they're asking them to do this step across Nucala and get sicker and wake up every morning and be short of breath and throw up and all that kind of thing. But even with the Nucala, he's paying $12.50 copay per dose. And sometimes they're able to get the copay cards. And then I explained to her how an accumulator works and how they're double dipping there. And she's just like totally incensed, grateful that I'm telling her this. But I guess what she was asking is, she's like, how can we figure out, is there a kickback for them to get Nucala on their formulary over Dupixent? And what is that kickback?
Well, excellent question. And Dr. Mass, I read your opinion in the Wall Street Journal the other day. Bravo on that.
Thank you.
I appreciate your longstanding advocacy on this stuff. When a PBM makes a formulary decision, it is not always governed by whether or not they receive a kickback. However, recognize that a kickback or a rebate is an enticement. A drug maker would not offer it unless they were getting something in return. This might surprise folks on the call, but drug makers also are not in the business of altruism and charity necessarily.
No.
So the question then is what governs and what drives a PBM's decision to make a change or adjustment on a formulary? And I'll be honest, I know many pharmacists and doctors that have been on P&T committees, some of which are very serious, and the PBM or plan sponsor takes those recommendations seriously. Others do not. However, sometimes I would argue a PBM is doing what I'll just say are good formulary decisions, where they're saying, look, this drug is of no value or little value, and so we're going to put up some barriers, or at least a lack of, or disincentivize utilization of a low value product to a patient. However, just like they can do that in a good way, they can also do it in a bad way. And so one of the things that I've always raised as a big concern is, do the PBMs have an inherent conflict of interest in making those decisions if they have the ability to profit off of those drug maker enticements? And back to what you're talking about, absolutely they do. Now, whether or not that's exactly what's happening with this instance, I think you'd be well within your right to assume that there has been some sort of jockeying for formulary placement with that, because we're talking about a competitive class product. Anytime that we see drugs that are in what we would just call a competitive class, we can reasonably assume that drug makers are jockeying with one another to increase the amount of concessions and rebates back to PBMs in order to entice utilization of their product over a competitor. Unfortunately, what that does is it inflates the list price of that medication, and also puts the patient in a precarious position where they're told, you have to take this drug or we're not covering it. So this is the industry dynamic that this creates. And I think that this is something that I do think the FTC needs to take a sharp look at. I think that more market-oriented folks would say, well, that's just the market working, right? That's the PBM doing its job, and it's putting drug makers in a position where they have to lower their prices in order to get covered. Unfortunately, what that dynamic does is it inflates the costs of both medications that are in question. So now both medications are now overinflated relative to their true net cost. So if I'm a patient and my health plan has picked one drug that doesn't work over a drug that does, now recognize that both those drugs are overinflated. So even if I wanted to go buy the other drug that's not covered, now the prices become so overinflated that it's not realistic for me to procure on the open market. That is a big problem. And what that does is it puts patients and their physicians in a position where it is unrealistic to use their own professional judgment to pick one product over another. You could argue that the PBM has de facto done it for them.
Dr. Mass, thank you. I hope that answered your question. I think we have time for one, perhaps two. Mark, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Mark. Mark Ost is a pharmacy owner in Pennsylvania. He's a part of both PPA and PARD, and those are free to care organizations, and we're happy that you're on. Please ask your question.
Sure. Hey, Antonio and David, thanks for doing this. So I just wanted to get your opinion. I know you're involved in nationally a lot of states. How does Pennsylvania compare to other states when it comes to PBM reform? And the second part of the question is, states that have enacted PBM reform, are they seeing the difference in not only patient care but also in reimbursement?
So from a PBM reform standpoint, every state comes in different shapes and sizes, and a lot of that has to do with either the regulatory landscape, the makeup of state legislatures, the prowess of their groundswell of those that are advocating for reform. There's a lot that goes into it. I do remember at one point, and I will apologize if I get this wrong, but if I remember correctly, there was a time when CVS Caremark had 13 registered lobbyists in the state of Pennsylvania just for their company, which was, mind-boggling to me as somebody in Ohio. They only had 4. So the disparity between the two of similar sized states was kind of stunning to me. I think from a sizing of the problem perspective, I have definitely seen Pennsylvania as one of the more overpriced states when it comes to the medications in the Medicaid program. From a reimbursement perspective, I can't say that I've analyzed Pennsylvania at a granular level to say whether or not pharmacies in Pennsylvania are being disproportionately harmed versus other states, though.
We've got time for one more. I've got one from Dr. Christina Dewey, and her question's a good one. Are the PBMs essentially practicing pharmacy and medicine by doing what they're doing? How are they skirting the fact that they're doing what they're not licensed to do?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's a great piggyback off of Dr. Mass's question. Look, I believe that some degree of formulary design is appropriate, right? But recognize that the second that you say that, the second that I say that, I'm acknowledging that a PBM and insurer can influence which medications are covered for a patient and which ones aren't. And let's be clear, we should be uncomfortable with that, right? That is practicing medicine without a license, or at least in a de facto manner. That's exactly what's happening. And so when it comes to whether we allow, if we're going to have a system that allows PBMs to engage in formulary design, whether that's a significant one, an intrusive one, or one that's not, you have to also acknowledge that is inserting a tremendous conflict of interest that is meant to usurp the decision-making process of doctors, pharmacists, and the patients they serve. We should have a degree of skepticism about that, especially as vertical integration enters the fold, right? Because now those same PBMs that are architecting formularies are the same companies that own their own pharmacies. They're the same companies that are now the largest employers of private physicians. So you have a very ugly Venn diagram that's starting to be created by the complexity of vertical integration. And I think that insurers and PBMs, if they're going to engage in these practices, I believe very strongly that states and feds should start looking at managed care as a quasi provider of sorts and exposing them to the same risks and hassles that traditional providers like physicians and pharmacists and nurses are already encumbered by.
That's an interesting perspective. And Antonio, I've got one question for you before we head out. What all of our groups can do that is so important is be engaged. I tell people all the time, yes, it's important to know who your state lawmakers are. It's even more important that they know who you are. Have them know who you are. Be a resource to them. The idea of accountability is so incredibly important, as we've heard today. Antonio, I want you to talk a little bit about what came out of the news yesterday, speaking of accountability, specifically in the state of Louisiana. Talk about what was requested and why, and what the response was of the insurer.
Yeah, so kind of breaking news yesterday was in the state of Louisiana, their state attorney general has now filed a lawsuit against United Healthcare and OptumRx. I want to be clear, United Healthcare and OptumRx aren't the only ones that engage in these behaviors. We saw it with Centene, we see it with CVS Caremark, we see it. These types of activities that they're going after and investigating are not exclusive to UHC Optum. But what the state attorney general did was ask and say, look, we want a bunch of your drug pricing data. Essentially, we want to see, how money flows through your company. We want to see how it flows to pharmacies. We want to see how you're itemizing that receipt when you submit that data back to the state, when they set capitation payments to the managed care plan, and when they're determining medical loss ratio requirements. And so over the course of, I believe it was about 5 months, they got about 2,200 different pages of documents, with which 83% were redacted. So, here we are, we're talking about one of the largest contractors of the state, and they're not being transparent with that very same state. And so what the Louisiana Attorney General is alleging is billions of dollars in excess charges on prescription drugs between United Healthcare and OptumRx, its subsidiary. Whether that's through spread pricing, clawbacks, rebate retention, you name it, the Attorney General of the state is not being allowed to be privy to the sensitive details that determine how the state is being charged for pharmaceuticals. That's a huge, huge problem, and it's not exclusive to Louisiana. It's not exclusive to United Healthcare, but it is indicative of some of the problems that we're seeing in this industry across the board. I can't tell you how many states I encounter who try to get an itemized accounting of how their PBM is exposing them to cost, only to be told that that's proprietary and they have no right to it. I can't believe that that's allowed. I can't believe that's okay. And it's not to say the PBM is good or bad here. It's just to say, look, this is basic governance. This is basic accountability when private contractors are interacting and receiving taxpayer dollars.
Well, Antonio, thank you so much. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for being here. And as far as what I know about you, I know that you're just getting started. And thank you for that effort that you're continuing to put in to fight for not only independent pharmacists and physicians, but most importantly for patients. For those of you who have not been able to look at the chat box, please follow us on social media. We have a lot of great information. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook. We're active on Twitter. We'd love for you to come and look at our website at freetocare.org. There is a link as well, and we'll post it again here shortly, that will take you to the it'll take you to a site that we've put together. We have a platform that will allow you to comment for the FTC, and that's, if you haven't done it already, please do it. Every comment matters. Each number matters. And I'll tell you why, just very quickly. Earlier this year, we commented on the GPOs. They benefit from the same exemption from the anti-kickback statute. We had 12,000 comments. Here, we're already closer to 17 from free-to-care, 16,000 from free-to-care alone. We're hoping that number from us is going to be closer to 20,000. We will then have a letter writing campaign to lawmakers across the country. And we want you to be involved in that as well, to say that, look, these numbers, these concerned citizens, many of them who are your constituents, care about this issue, and you should too. So please help us in this fight. Thank you for your support, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, David.
My pleasure.